Good afternoon. Let's get started. Our speaker next week will be Alan Goodrich, who is a senior analyst at the National Renewable Energy Lab. He will talk about building and maintaining competitive advantage in clean manufacturing. He has done some very pioneering work looking at solar industry and competitive advantage between the US and China, cost of production, tariffs, and so on. So I highly encourage you to join us next week. Our speaker today is our own Kate Galbraith. Kate covers energy and environment for the Texas Tribune. She reported on clean energy for the New York Times from 2008 to 2009, serving as the lead writer for the Times Green blog. Her career began at The Economist in 2000, and between 2005 and 2007, she was in Austin as the magazine Southwest correspondent. From 2007 to 2008, she was the Nyman Fellow in Journalism at the Harvard University. She has an undergraduate degree in English from Harvard and a master's degree from the London School of Economics. Please join me in welcoming Kate. You have wired her up.
Yes, I feel like a porcupine or something, but it's just so you can hear me, and if you can't even hear me with the mic, I encourage you to move up. But thanks so much, Varun and everybody, for having me here. It's really awesome to be here. You guys have amazing speakers, so it's really cool to be here, and it's also fun because I'm usually the one sitting in the audience and asking the questions, so it's kind of funny to be on the other side. And this will be one of the less technical presentations you'll probably hear. I'll be just talking about kind of what I do as an energy reporter, how I think up stories, talking about communicating energy issues, because, of course, it's wonderful to have great research, but, also important that people can kind of know about it and learn about it, and that's what one of the things we do in the press. So just to elaborate a little bit more, I'm not an engineer. I have an undergraduate degree in English. I started out actually writing travel guides. If any of you all have used the Let's Go or the Lonely Planet guides, I wrote portions of some of those guides to Eastern Europe and Micronesia. I actually had to look up where Micronesia was before I accepted that assignment. But and then I was lucky enough to get a job at The Economist after a couple of stints in those places, and I started out as an intern on the website, and then several years later I was moved over to the paper, as they call it, in London. I was working in London, and they put me in the finance section, writing about insurance, stock exchanges, and fund management. So that's a bit of a gulp for an English major, and I did that for a year in London, and then I said, can I not cover finance anymore, and can I please come back to the United States? And so they sent me to Texas, where I was Southwest correspondent for a couple of years. I don't know if you all know Erica Greeter. She's been doing that ever since, although she actually just moved over to be a senior editor at Texas Monthly, which is really exciting. So anyway, then I bounced around for the East Coast. I was at the Times for a couple years, 2008, 2009. I got laid off in a big round at the end of 2009, but I had that's kind of the nature of my industry, is that it's very tenuous, and so I had a backup plan in case that ever happened, and I moved back here, and I begged Evan Smith, our editor-in-chief, for a job, and happily it worked out. So that's a little about me, and also myself and Asher Price, who is a Austin American Statesman reporter, have a book coming out next June, I think. It's called The Great Texas Wind Rush, and it's basically a history of the wind power revolution in Texas, how the oil and gas state became #1 in wind. So we're pretty excited about that. And let's see, you all are probably fairly familiar with the Texas Tribune, so I won't spend too much time on it. I am clearly a better reporter than I am a marketer, because when I was walking up here, I realized I forgot all my little, bumper stickers and materials I'm supposed to bring to these events. But Students can become members for $10. You get information on our fun happy hours and cool bumper magnets that were cooler than the things I was going to hand out anyway. And so we cover politics and policy in the state of Texas. This is a picture from election night. We were all here, all in the office until I left at 1 a.m. There were still a bunch of people there doing write-ups on Texas elections. I think I'm over there in the corner. I have a great corner window so I can look out and see like when zombies do the thriller across the street, across Congress Ave. Everybody comes to the window and we all look out. So it's a very fun place to work. We just had our 3rd anniversary. And yeah, we had, about 5 million visits January to June, and we've just been growing and doing great. Evan Smith says we have 17 reporters now. None of us can quite count them. I think it's closer to like 13 or 14, but we're a small staff. We have a lot of fun, and we make do. We also have a partnership, as you all probably know, with the New York Times twice a week. Some of our stories, 3 of our stories plus one from Texas Monthly, run in special Texas pages of the New York Times. It's actually my story from last Friday, I think, on kids learning about water conservation. The photograph is really cool, so they put it really big. That's the very simple formula. And let's see, this is the Times website. I like this because of the URL that they give us, national/US territories, states, territories, and possessions. And yes, and the last thing to know about the Texas Tribune is we also have a really bad softball team called the Runoffs. Called the Runoffs. If we get one run, it is miraculous. Anyway, so I cover energy environment, and what does that mean? The first thing it means is that I have a public-facing job, and I get some really weird emails. This I received, true story, when I worked at the New York Times in 2009. Yes, does mean hate mail. Yes, I showed this around the newsroom. Everyone fell over laughing. Obviously my picture was up on the website, and someone suggested I write back, Dear Darcy, I think Frank Rich could use a makeover too, but I never quite got around to it. So more relevantly, kind of what it means is I do a lot energy environment. I cover a lot of sort of water. I cover a lot of wind, fracking, oil, a lot of ERCOT grid, Texas grid sort of wonkery. I try to translate that into normal people terms. That is a particular challenge. Some coal, air pollution. It's a lot. I'm one reporter. I cover energy environment, and I wish we had probably 5 at least. It's just, people ask me, can you come to Midland? We've got a real big issue with oil wells being drilled in town, and this neighborhood is opposed to this big issue. I would love to go to Midland and do that. That's a great story, but it's 5 hours to Midland, and I've got time calculations to make. It's just very difficult to make these choices when there's so many great stories. And Texas is just a great place to be a journalist because, we've got great we've got all kinds of energy, as you all know, wind, oil, gas, etc., biomass. And people here are just kind of more open about things than they are on the East Coast. When I worked at the New York Times, people would, the CEOs of these companies would come up to me and say, they'd come into my office and they'd be flanked by 3 public relations people, and they'd sort of, you could kind of almost tell by the number of public relations people they brought how, interesting or not interesting they were going to be. And, here in Texas, there's nothing I love better than talking to a rancher out in West Texas and, you just kind of get the straight story in sort of normal terminology, and that's pretty neat. So yeah, here's some just a couple other examples of stories I've done. Let's see, this kind of, I spotted this on the way back from Waco. This just kind of summarizes what I like about Texas. It's just, you get just signs like this, and it's just a great place to be as a reporter. So I'll talk just a little bit about what I do try to cover. As we're a nonprofit at the Texas Tribune, we have one energy environment staff. That's me, and so, I try to, I take our nonprofit mission very seriously in that I want to add kind of value to what the public knows about journalism. So if the Dallas Morning News does a great story on zebra mussels, or the San Antonio Express News covers the Eagleford Shale really well, then I'll leave that to them. I mean, I get people asking me, why aren't you covering the tar sands protests? And, the answer is that if I knew of a way I could kind of add value to the story, I would do that. But if I can't, and there may be something broader in thinking about, the way eminent domain law in Texas compares to that of other states, just things like that. But if I can't, I covered the tar sands 2 years ago, the Keystone Pipeline, when I didn't feel anyone else in the Texas media was really covering it, and now there's just a flood of coverage, so I back off, and that's great. I'm not perfect at that. We do sometimes chase some breaking news stories, like this Luminant decision, just because I've become an electric grid wonk. I feel like now I know the terminology or some of it. I need to use it. So this piece about Luminant shutting some of its coal units for 6 months. This, again, chasing a breaking news story, a federal decision about listing the sage-breast lizard in West Texas, and then you write the story, and then people start emailing you all the rest of the day, and they want their comments in the story, and you can update it and put some comments in, and then after a while kind of cut it off. So a little bit, by the way, feel free to ask questions at any point. If you have them, we'll have time for questions, obviously, at the end too. So how do I think up stories? This is, for me, thinking up stories is kind of the most fun thing that I do. I'll explain how I do that in a minute, but when I get an idea, I have a giant disorganized list on my computer that I just pop the story idea into. And my basic criteria are, is it original? Am I adding value? As I said before, what is new or what's changed in recent years? Why is it news? Is this story interesting to me? Because I'm the one who has to spend time on it and write it, and I'd rather not be bored. Is it an unusual story? This ran in our New York Times partnership, what would it be, about a couple years ago, and I wouldn't do this story on Austin. Austin's going green. Well, everybody's written that story, but Houston, having a local food market and doing some various other electric car and so on initiatives, I put that all together and I thought, that's interesting. When Waco goes green, I'll be there as well. That's also actually why Asher and I got interested in writing our wind book. I mean, it was one of the first stories that grabbed me when I first came to Texas in 2005. I thought, wind power in Texas, the oil and gas state, and I've just been fascinated by that dynamic ever since and realized that in many ways it's actually no coincidence, but you have to read the book to find out why that is. And then, there's also, when I think about stories, there's also the kind of who cares question. Does this story have regional appeal? Does it matter to other people outside the area? is there a good photograph to go with the story? That's particularly important for our New York Times partnership. I love this photo. Axel Gerdeau, who I'm sure a lot of you know, went out to the Panhandle with me, and we did a story on these guys called windmillers who fix these old water windmills, and he just took some amazing images of these guys up on the wheels working without helmets. And you know, that kind of story really gives us the opportunity, or that kind of photo gives us the opportunity to have a really nice spread in our New York Times partnership. Let's see. A lot of people also ask me, you know, can you do a story about my solar panel, or, you know, my new kind of algae, or, you know, this oil additive? And, you know, almost invariably I say no, because I try to say it politely, but because, you know, first of all, I cover policy issues at the Texas Tribune, and second of all, I have no idea if this particular technology is good or not, and I have, you know, no time to invest in finding out. I mean, that's what venture capitalists and actual investors are for, and so, you know, I really leave that to trade press or whoever wants to cover that. That's almost that's pretty much an across the board rule. One company, when I worked at the Times, that really caught my eye, that was doing a new thing was, has anyone heard of, it's now called O-Power, it was called Positive Energy. Yeah, they do these, they send your electric bill in, and you get like a smiley face if you're doing better than your neighbors in a very general average. You get it like a, you know, flat face or no face if, you know, you're about the same, and then you get a frowny face if you're doing worse. And that's fascinating. And I walked over the sample electric bill to a colleague of mine at the Times, who then wrote a front page piece on that. I think they've eliminated the frowny face since, because people got upset. But it was, you know, that's a really interesting company. It's doing well, yeah.
Yeah. I'm just curious, so do you ever have time to actually do a little bit of, let's say, investigative reporting on a, let's say somebody calls you up with a product that they're working on, and you want to sort of vet the idea amongst others? You have contacts about it. I would want your contact for a while. Do you have time to do that still?
I probably could make time, but it's pretty much my iron rule that I don't, because, you know, I just don't want to open that door up, and, you know, that's not, my job really is much more policy focused in any case. If I wrote about technology, absolutely, but, you know, the policy gives me kind of the backing to be able to just avoid those stories. You know, because I don't want to spend a lot of time and then not have something come out of it. It's, you know, again, there's a lot of time calculations here. So how do I think up stories? Well, a lot of times it's just talking to people that I normally talk to on my beat. Amy Hardberger, who worked for the Environmental Defense Fund based out of Lubbock. She's now in San Antonio. She mentioned to me well, not quite so offhand, but maybe a year ago, that during the drought last year, some panhandle farmers were watering crops because of federal crop insurance incentives, even though they knew that cotton wouldn't grow. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. So I called up a bunch of farmers, and they're upset too. They don't want to be watering, and it was an interesting problem. I don't know if there's an easy solution. This was a favorite piece of mine. This actually ran in the Times about a week after I got laid off, but I was very committed to having the story run because I was pretty pleased with it, and it went up to number 2 most emailed list, and I beat out David Brooks at one point, so that was very exciting. But I had heard about this just in casual conversation with a friend of a friend who said, my brother works for a company, he's a rock climber, and he works for a company that hires rock climbers to fix wind turbines. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And so I stored that idea away. I confess I sat on it for about a year, just meaning to get to it. But again, we're so busy. And finally I was able to do that, and spent this wonderful day at a wind farm out in Pennsylvania. These guys they climbed up to the top of the tower up above the nacelle, and then just descended downward. It was pretty great. See, this was another story I just happened across. I was in Boise, Idaho, for a different New York Times story in 2009 about demand response, and somebody said, oh, you got to go meet Dave Crick at the Bitter Creek Ale House. He's very green, so I'm like, yeah, but I go meet Dave Crick, and he's doing this is the most interesting example of a restaurant going green that I've ever come across. I mean, you hear restaurants going green, my silverware is compostable and whatever. That's kind of boring, to be honest, these days, but this guy, I mean, he had listed on his menu like how many miles the beer had come, and kind of more materially, he had a compost bin in the basement. He had low power happy hour. He got rid of a bunch of old refrigerators, and now he actually buys whole cows so that his chefs are like forced to use all the parts of the cow. I mean, he's really just thinking he puts a lot of interesting ideas together, and I always wished I could do a bigger story in that, but again, just never got the time. It's kind of still on my list, and probably will be for a while. Yeah.
On that, is it the time constraint for you that decides whether you do a shorter story, or is it also the interaction with the editors?
No, the time constraint is me. I'm constantly doing a lot of stories, and I mean, I'm a reporter. I often write 2 stories a week, and I also I don't have a secretary. I arrange my own travel. I mean, I do all kinds of I arrange photographs. I mean, we do a lot more than just reporting, and so I'm just there's a giant list of things. The editing process of the Tribune is very efficient. I really like that, but yeah.
Do you find sometimes it's difficult, like walking the line between journalism and advocacy? I mean, do you feel sometimes people you won't report my warts because you're a person?
I really don't get that. I'm sure people do. I've been gratified a number of times that people on the environmental side and the oil side will both say great story, and when that happens, you're like jackpot. But no, I mean, I've had people say, thank you for doing, I do a story about the production tax credit, the expiring tax credit that the wind industry says is crucial, and people say, oh, thank you for doing this story. It really, it's really great for our industry. Well, I mean, I'm not doing it for the industry. I'm doing it because it's a story. So I really, we do take, we are objective, and I do my absolute best to be fair and report both sides, and I'm very open to, feedback and so on. Yeah.
Well, have you heard about this? I think there's a controversy with the San Saba River, and I just wonder if you heard about this, or if this is getting news.
No, but tell me about it afterward. So other story ideas I get sometimes from Google Alerts. I have some ridiculous amount of Google Alerts, like 30 or something, set up on Texas and coal and Texas and water, Texas and wind, Texas and this, and some of my water things started turning up. These stories out of Midland, which last year was, or has been in a very serious water situation, very dry out there, and they have traditionally not had watering restrictions. They've just been like, we live in a dusty oil town, we'd like to come home to green grass. And last year when the drought really just diminished, it wiped out 2 of their 3 lakes, and the third was down at 12% full before storm pretty much doubled it. They got very serious about water, but they had some interesting kind of cultural, it's just been an interesting cultural switch from a place that really isn't very keen on, kind of government regulation. Even water regulation can be a little painful. And so I've done a few Texas Monthly stories here and there, and that was one of them. Let's see. Yeah, this was another story that this farmer out in West Texas, he called me, hello Kate, this is blah, 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 and I've got a story for you. And it was a great story. It's about cotton farmers in West Texas who are, unhappy because the local groundwater district was imposing restrictions for the first time on how much they can pump and making them put meters on wells, and $2,000 a meter. If you got, 10 or 20, 30 meters on your land, that can add up. And so there's a really interesting kind of property right dynamic. And I love going out to West Texas, and I went out West Texas and did that story. I get a lot of story ideas from public relations people. The answer, for the most part, is not really. Press releases, can be helpful, but they don't usually lead me to an interesting feature idea. But there are exceptions. Like here, a fellow called John Bender. I'm not sure if he's based here in West Texas, but he asked me to have coffee, and I did, and he told me about changes to the Conservation Reserve Program, sort of program to preserve land out in West Texas, or land around the country. And I ended up going out and doing a story. You can see this was one of our stories from a couple of years ago when I was still being the photographer. Happily, they've put me off that role, so that's a good thing. Some stories I think up that are just kind of questions in my head, like, so we've got a lot of smart electric meters deployed around the state. What about smart water meters? So that was kind of all I knew, and I asked one of our interns, John Ferguson, to do a story on that, and he just called a bunch of water utilities and reported to the extent that we could. It's difficult often, and in that case, to get centralized information, but we do the best we can. Let's see. Sometimes I do probably more than my share of stories about ERCOT, the Texas grid, and I do sometimes chase the ERCOT is raising a wholesale price cap story, because that is a very important thing for the state. But I've also tried to do things that this is kind of more an analysis piece that ran this week, I guess. Everything blurs together in my mind, to be honest, but since the election particularly. But it's, I've just noticed that they talk all about, what about capacity market, the market, and how do we change the peaker net margin and just all this stuff. And then, but there's really not a lot of talk about how much it costs. And so I did an analysis piece looking at that. And I am a history buff, so I sometimes just do random articles too, like this one, how Texas Longhorns were, sort of almost going extinct, and then some federal Forest Service folks rounded up a bunch of the remaining ones in the sort of 20s, 30s, and took them to an Oklahoma refuge. And this was very opportunistically pegged to the OU game, of course. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our data, our amazing data journalism. Ryan Murphy is a U2 grad from 2010. He's one of my colleagues. He graduated with a degree in multimedia journalism. He's doing just amazing things for for the Texas Tribune. I mean, you know, a story maybe even a few years ago, we didn't have this idea of, you know, data or journalism being so visual, and people just want to see stuff and not always to read about it. And so he did this map that actually live feeds through from the Texas Water Development Board about reservoir levels. So this is actually current on, yes, on 11/6. The story, we originally put it in on April 12th, but it auto feeds through. And you can see this just captures in a snapshot the water problems of West Texas. You know, red means bad, like 25% full or less. Green means good, you know, 75% full or more. So it really just shows the climate of the state in a way that's much better than I could write about. Here's another story I was quite pleased with. Susana Jacob is the editor of the student newspaper here this year. She was one of our interns, and I had not gone to this particular water hearing last November, but Ken Kramer, who's the head of the, or until recently was the head of the Sierra Club here in Texas, he had gone to this water hearing, and I was talking to him about water issues, and he just mentioned, oh, you know, I was just at this hearing. I think I didn't go to the hearing because I didn't know about it. Sometimes, you know, electricity or water gets heard in committees that I didn't expect or I'm not on the list of, and so it's sometimes a little catch-up game, but I do the best I can. Anyway, he had been to this hearing. He said, well, one thing, the mayor of this town of Groesbeck, she was sort of crying when she mentioned her town was about to run out of water over Thanksgiving, which, as you can see, was just a couple of weeks away. And so I was like, oh, that's really interesting. This was, again, in the height of the drought. And so I looked up the video and found her testimony, and she was, you know, indeed very upset. And so I had other stories to write, but I dispatched Susana to Groesbeck, and she did the story. And then poor Groesbeck, the national media, like, descended. CNN was there, and, you know, it just got, like, crazy, you know, because everyone, you know, I mean, this is not a great thing to say about the news media, but everyone was fascinated by the story of, you know, Texas town running out of water. And indeed, this is one of the things that really gets in the minds of state lawmakers, is they're worried about the image of Texas, and too many people around the country reading these kinds of articles and thinking that Texas is a worrying place to invest. But anyway, one of the things that the mayor had also mentioned in her testimony, which she said, we're number 2 on the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality's list of towns that are going to run out of water. And so I heard that. I was like, there's a list? And, you know, so I immediately contacted TCQ. I got the list, and so I have this list of, you know, 10 towns running out of water and when they're going to run out and that kind of thing. And I'm just kind of talking, oh, I have this list, and I was telling Evan, our chief executive, about it, and he was like, well, duh, get it mapped. I was like, oh yeah, get it mapped. And so I really am still learning about how to adjust my thinking too. This is the newer map, but it's kind of, I wish I could do it interactive here, but you just hover over one of these drops and tells you what town it is and when they'll run out of water, and you know, why there's a problem, and so on. So yeah, that's been up for a while. And again, that also auto feeds from the TCQ website, which they've now got on the website. It updates every week. So what my colleague Ryan, can do is really amazing. This is another very, very cool graphic. I was at Stanford University in February doing, they have a Center for the American West, and I was doing a piece on water rates, and they did this amazing interactive. You can click all kinds of things, and interesting patterns show up. And anyway, this was a pretty amazing demonstration. This, let's see, just about done here. I think I can't. This was a video. I guess I can't. Sometimes it you can play it if it's embedded in a presentation. But yeah.
I have a question regarding stories that you may want to find interesting that you want to put out there. But are there any instances in which you feel that there are political constraints to particular stories where you're not necessarily given free will?
No. No. Can't think of one. Yeah. Yeah.
So, am I okay? So you don't have a particular beat, just energy in general?
Yes, energy environment. That's supposed to be my particular beat. But yes, it is very general. So it's anything energy environment within Texas, and that's a lot.
And then the second question is, where is your audience? Who is the audience of the Texas Tribune? Is it everybody and anybody, or is there one group more than others that come to reach you guys and go to you?
Our audience is definitely everybody and anybody. You know, it's a free online resource. I don't have at my fingertips percentage of readers in Austin versus out of Austin versus out of state, but you know, it's a very good balance. And also, in addition to some of our stories running in the Times, we allow local publications, local papers to reprint our stories if they want to. And you know, oftentimes I'll see my stories running in the Lubbock paper, the Midland paper, whatever, and that's pretty cool. And that's how you reach very general audience too. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. You.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, first of all, so much for doing what you do. I was giving a presentation in an economics class at LBJ just yesterday on PV in Texas, and hands immediately shot up, and it turned out only a fraction of the class even knew what PV was, so there's definitely work to do, and thank you so much. So my question is actually about kind of the spread of interest and expertise in this field, specifically women in energy. And I imagine you've had a problem with the grasp on who's doing what where. So for me, there's not a lot of women to look up to. There are more. There aren't a lot. So what do you think are some of the success stories around that? What have you encountered in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not super well versed in it because, yes, I do mostly encounter men, but, you know, I know like the head of Sunrun, which is a California-based solar installation company. There's a woman at the head of that. One or some of the big energy companies out of Houston, if I don't do a story on a topic, then it's not like in my head. But, you know, I would love to see, you know, to interact with more women myself, because if I'm at a conference, I mean, honestly, yeah, I feel more comfortable, like, you know, striking up a conversation with a woman. Like, you know, it's just kind of how it is. And, yeah. Yeah.
I've got a two-part question. One is, do you ever find that engineers or scientists who work in the energy industry try to get into journalism and become writers, either, you know, in any of the media? And the second part of the question is, do they ever succeed?
Great question. Well, at The Economist, they have internships every summer at least for science and technology writers. It's a great internship. I mean, you write. And they always advertise for scientists who would like to write as opposed to writers who might be interested in science. And so I know that a bunch of folks have been through that process. And I was not a science intern, but I don't have a science background. But yes, they, for example, specifically look for that. Yeah.
Sort of on that same line, oftentimes we see in energy journalism confusion about numbers, megawatt hours, technical terms you mentioned, power balance, penalty curve, create margins. What's your approach to dealing with the tension of the fact that those are very important to often some of the decisions that are being made, and the fact that 99% of your readership doesn't have an introduction to that?
The answer is that whenever possible, I avoid those terms, including, megawatts and megawatt hours. I would, sometimes they're unavoidable, in which case I just, try to be, I am aware of this, I try to be extra careful, because, it's also not natural to me, but, I'd much rather write about rather than something, climbing from, 900 kilowatt hours to 1800, I'd rather write doubled. That's how you get around it. And, a lot of the terms in ERCOT, I just try to translate. I mean, I do still worry about even just using the term wholesale makes me cringe. And I try to, to the extent that I can, I try to demystify these things. But ERCOT is something else. I mean, yeah, it took me a couple of years to just get a basic understanding of what deregulation in Texas was, and I just it wasn't directly that I acquired that understanding while it wasn't directly part of my job. I wasn't covering Texas day to day, but it was tough, and it still is. Peaker net margin and a lot of stuff still eludes me. Vern, could I get some more water?
Sure. While I'm getting some water, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
So when something new comes up, for example, smart grids, on which you're not an expert, so what type of calculation is going through your head? How much time do I spend on researching, learning? Is it really the part that I want to invest in, or should I just keep writing about deregulation in Texas? What is that new calculation?
Right. Great question. Well, I kind of run through my general, what's new about the smart grid? Is it something that other people aren't writing about? How important is it? I mean, I'll give you an example. One thing on my list is to, nobody steal my idea, but is to write about smart meters. We've deployed a tremendous number of smart meters in Texas, and my question is, are we getting full value for those smart meters? And I'll be eager to hear sort of arguments on both sides. My working hypothesis is no, because we don't have kind of time of use information and all that. But yeah, I'm doing a complex calculation of what else is on my list. Do we have, is the story going to run in our New York Times partnership or not? If it is, we need to plan it in advance and take care of photographs and just be, that's just a little bit of additional time and editing, and so there's just there's a variety of factors. Yeah.
Okay. So the big war, it seems like, between Texas and the EPA, can you distill this down for us a little bit? Have you covered part of that at all?
Yeah, I do. And yes, Texas is warring with the EPA over most types of regulation, from greenhouse gas, which Texas lost, to the cross-state air pollution rule, which Texas won. And I wish I were a legal reporter and kind of had time to just really kind of follow these day to day. But with something like that, to be honest, I kind of see a story, the story happens, and then 10 weeks later there's another spat with the EPA over a different rule, and I then have to go back and remember all the things that happened 10 weeks ago, because in the meantime my head is full of smart grid and it's, so I don't have any profound thoughts for you other than I'm sure this will continue.
How much of it is just trying to score points in anti-Washington versus some really true philosophical differences? Where do you perceive that?
Well, see, if I answered that, I would be probably violating my strict rules of objectivity. So, I have to be, that's why I talk about communicating on energy rather than, energy itself. Yeah.
So great setup for my question, which is if you're one of, so when you call someone who's at the university and has technical expertise, there's always some struggle because you're trying to translate for the public.
Yeah.
And our goals, university people's goals, are often not quite parallel and can be drastically non-parallel. So what can you do to increase? What can I, as a university, do to, when talking to a journalist, to increase my chances of being quoted correctly, and especially correctly in context? Like often we won't answer a question, yes, this will work. We want to say something more nuanced, and you only have about this much line space. How are we going to get the communication going to get through that?
That is a very good question. Well, one part of that answer is that there's currently a real discussion in journalism about, kind of quote approval. This discussion began during the Obama campaign when a New York Times story showed that the Obama campaign would only talk on the record if it approved quotes that it had said. And then the Times came down hard on that and said that's ridiculous. The kind of public editor, the Times oversight kicked in, and journalists are moving away from that, which doesn't help you, because then it's like, how do I be more accurate? One way to do that, if you're not, one way to do that is find a journalist you trust. Another way is email, but that's kind of less fun from a journalist perspective, because when you're talking, it's more colloquial, and that's just oftentimes a better way to communicate with readers. So there's honestly no great answer. I know what you mean. I can have a 30-minute conversation with you, and then I'm going to use a line, and you don't know which line that is, and you have to kind of trust me that I'm using my best judgment, but fundamentally there's no way around that. Yeah.
In that same vein, the PolitiFact type article or editorial space seems a growth industry when we're vetting politician statements. And I was wondering how you would reflect on your own industry in journalism in terms of just correcting stories if you have factual errors. So you get a front page article, it has an error, and then maybe 2 weeks later there's a correction on page 3 that obviously doesn't reach the same audience.
Right, and that's like the New York Times will have these corrections on page 2 or 3 in the paper. They do append the corrections to the web version, which is what a lot of folks see. But yes, if I write an article, first of all, I've been through the whole Times thing. I mean, when you work for the Times, you're aware that the entire world is like waiting breathlessly for you to make a mistake, and so you're very careful, which just puts a lot of extra time into the articles, and I do that still. It's been very good training. But yes, if I've made a mistake, I want to know about it, and we'll put a correction. I mean, we do that at the Texas Tribune as well, just like an editor's note at the bottom of the article.
I think the online format gives you an added advantage.
Right.
You can't go back and update it. So the article.
Yeah, there's no way to update dead wood, I guess. Yeah.
So speaking of the online venue for this sort of thing, what for you and what you're covering here, what kind of rivalry do you have to kind of be aware of that the blogs are covering? Like, what's that competition like? And what do you offer for what you're doing that blogs who are covering the same thing, same area aren't?
Well, as part of our public service mission, I just try to, if a blog is covering it, I don't view that as competition. I view that as great, because there's so much in Texas to cover on energy environment. For example, State Impact Texas launched, I think, last year, and they've done a lot of water reporting, and that's enabled me to pull back a little bit from day-to-day stuff. So I'm not a competitive person with other journalists. I leave that for running races, but I do just want. I think that there's a huge universe of news that doesn't get reported, and so if somebody else reported it, that's great, and I'll do something else. And we can put it. I put it on my Far Too Active Twitter feed if I see it, and also we have a sort of tribwire for Texas stories by other publications. So, yeah.
As an observer, just in general of the energy industry, do you feel like there's a particular issue or framework in the topic in general that gets covered more than others? And I guess I'm asking this from the perspective that there seems to be a lot of coverage about energy, particularly given the price increases in electricity across the country and gasoline. And yet very few people I know personally have any, much like economics and TV class, any idea what the relationships are. So I'm just wondering, and yet there's just so much information out there, not just in your publication, but the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, all these places. So I'm just wondering if you think there's a particular area that gets covered way more than others, or from sort of a national.
Sure. I mean, so on the broad stories, it's hard to do a broad story because you have to devote a lot of space in a given story to kind of the pullback. And one example of somebody doing that really well is Justin Gillis, who works in the New York Times. He was my editor on the business section when I was there, and he's covering climate change now. And he just he writes these huge front page stories on climate change that really give you the big picture and also really dig into the issue. But then you look, and how much space do they give him? They give him like thousands of words, and that's pretty unusual. That's like a lot of devotion of time and research. And so yeah, there's a trade-off between kind of time and research. I mean, in terms of issues that are overcovered, undercovered, I mean, sort of my observation, and I'm guilty of this too, is that when journalists cover energy environment, I think we generally actually cover energy a lot more than we do environment, like water and air pollution. And I've been trying to think of kind of why that is, and don't have really great answers, but maybe there's lots of different forms of energy. And I think we particularly cover like wind and solar power a lot, partly because they're new, but also, wind turbines are fun to write about because they're so visually interesting, and they've got, they make great photos on, whatever page you're writing about, and so that's definitely a more interesting depiction than just sort of your usual power plants. But I think one issue that is significantly undercovered is water. I mean, water fascinates me. I've done a lot of writing about that because it's like the one thing Texas can't build more of. We can to an extent. We can build desal plants and recycled water, and but fundamentally there is a limit, and so that just sort of intrigues me as injecting a different dynamic into the discussion. Yeah.
You just mentioned the point you can't bring water. I'll throw it to you. You're talking about the XL pipeline. Why don't you go up to the Great Slave Lake and start an 18, 20, 32, 36-inch pipeline of water and put it into LA, put it into Texas, and put it into every place else?
Well, if you do, I'll be glad to write about it.
We need to deal with the Canadians. We don't need their oil, we need their water.
Well, we will need water, and yes.
They have plenty of water.
Yeah, I'll write about it.
When I read the Tribune, I feel, and this is coming from a non-journalist perspective, but I feel like it's a unique beast, and I feel like it's in some ways meant to attempt to face the challenges of journalism today in today's age. I was curious, when you talk to other journalists, where do you see journalism going 5, 10 years from now? In job security, in terms of what your animal looks like?
Wow, great question, and we all wish we knew. I mean, it's a very tense time in journalism. A lot of folks, particularly at the traditional newspapers, worried for their job. There's layoff after layoff. And so, I think there is a perception that the future is organizations like the Texas Tribune that are sprouting up around the country. There's like VT Digger in Vermont, MinPost, Minnesota, Sign-On, San Diego. So there are a lot. Clearly the reading public is moving, online rather than offline. And, the nonprofit model, it's, fortunately I don't have to deal with this, but the folks who, organize sponsorships, raise money for the Tribune are very active on this all the time. So it's, it's a high maintenance operation, but it pays off. So not a great answer, but yeah.
Okay. We're running out of time.
Yes.
Do you have any final thoughts, and then we can come back to questions if we have some more time?
No, my final thought is it's been really fun to be here. So thanks.
We can continue with the questions. Go ahead.
I was going to say, science, energy and environment both have scientific and technical sides, which probably a lot of people in this room focus on. But because of their nature, they're also political and emotional issues. So when you write an extremely objective article based on what you've learned in your research and whatnot, do you get responses from people who want you to, talk about the other side? Racism, the other side.
Well, we will put, I'm not quite sure how to answer that because there's no real equivalent of that in what I cover. Maybe a little bit climate change. I'm following the New York Times sort of guidelines on that climate change exists. It is caused by, humans, and, we'll get, I think probably, occasional comments on that, but no, I've, not really. I once wrote a blog post when I was at the New York Times on the carbon a study out of Oregon State University that purported to quantify the carbon footprint of having children. And all I did was write an objective article about the study. And, 300 comments later, we deleted the comments that were insults. I got an email, you should be retroactively aborted for writing about this. I deleted that one pretty quick. Yeah.
You've got an enormously rich beat writing on energy and environment here in Texas, and you make, it appears just the way you describe your job, you make tens of decisions a week on just what it is you're going to write on and cover. But you're looking with 20/20 hindsight. What when you talk about a little bit some of the stories that you didn't write that you wish you had that that got past you in some way or another?
Well, I would say that it would be just a lot of the stories that are still on my list. Again, I try not to cover I try not to chase the kind of breaking stories of the day too much. There are exceptions. I'm not perfect, but yeah, there are things on my list like how's the Rio Grande doing? Sort of I'd love to kind of travel up and down, but yeah, it's just.
Yeah, I was thinking of things that not
I know.
on your list, but things that where time has passed and in retrospect you said, damn, I wish I'd written that story.
It's a great question, and I think I just haven't kind of taken or had the time for retrospection. But that's not to say that there wouldn't be any. Yeah.
Are there any final questions?
Do you ever, so you mentioned some stories which you just didn't have time for, or maybe you had another staff member who could take it on. Do you find yourself passing a lot of stories to your, a technology beat reporter? It sounds like you probably get pitched a lot for those types of things, and it's not really, you're doing more policy versus the technology to solve the problem.
So do you collaborate with the technology beat reporter very often?
I often fantasize about having one. Yeah, whenever possible, I will pass a story on to one of our interns, and we've been lucky to have a really talented crop. But yeah, it's either them or me or none of the above. So, yeah.
Let's thank you so much.